Hopefully everyone can hear me, even with the roaming mic. Everyone's good at the back. So, thank you very much to Matt for inviting me here today to talk to you. I'm going to talk to you about beating the heat before, during and after athletic competition. Before I get started, I'd just like to disclose some of those entities I've received funding from, suppliers I've received equipment for at discounted rates or in kind, and thank those teams that have given me access to their players, particularly those elite teams. So we're all well aware of those sensationalist headlines we see in the press regarding elite competition within heat. What's particularly presented is the negative influence of that and potential exertional heat illnesses. However, today I'm going to talk more about the effects of heat on performance. Now, if we consider soccer match play, a highly variable dynamic game, and if we consider the data from the Brazil World Cup, we saw with increasing wet bulb globe temperature, so the best index of heat stress for our players. Okay. Is that better? Sorry. Okay. So if we consider the data from the Brazil World Cup, and if we look at the increase in wet bulb globe temperature, the best index of heat to gauge how stressful an environment will be for our players, we saw marked reductions with increases in WBGT in high-speed distances covered. And if we look at some experimental match play, so a game performed here in Qatar at 43 degrees C and 21 degrees C, we also see marked reductions. Now the problem is, if we really want to explore interventions to offset these high-speed decrements in performance, soccer match play is far too variable. It's a semi-chaotic environment. So we tend to use soccer simulations to give us more internal validity and precision regarding the effectiveness of our interventions. So using a valid and reliable simulation, we showed the difference between the simulation performed at 30 degrees C and 18 degrees C. And we saw these same reductions in high-speed distances covered. Most interestingly, when we asked players to perform high-speed movements, so their self-paced willingness to perform high-speed movements, this was also reduced. And the relationship with physiology is pretty much related to core body temperature with some individual variation. When we exceed 39 degrees C, our ability to express repeatedly high-speed movements becomes decremented. And if we look at this in a more endurance paradigm, modelling some of the data from the IAAF World Championships between 1999 and 2011. And if we look at these two figures here, on panel A we have the males data, panel B we have the females data. And if we look across the x-axis, we see the events, and on the y-axis we have the change in performance in percent. It's a pretty simple relationship. As the temperature increases, performance becomes decremented in those long distance events. So why does this occur? Well, it's pretty simple physiology. If we don't put up the conceptual heat balance equation, it can appear slightly complicated. We'll look at a practical example. If we start on the left-hand side, we have heat gain, particularly from the environment. So that's solar radiation, some of that's reflected from the ground, and the ambient air temperature and humidity. In the middle, we have heat production, which is essentially the athlete, their metabolic heat production, essentially linearly related to O2 consumed. So we're gaining heat from the environment, we're also producing heat. So we evidently need to lose this heat. We have several predominant pathways where we can dissipate this heat. We have dry convective heat loss, which is essentially convection and radiation from the skin. We get hot, we shunt the blood from the core to the skin to lose heat. But if we consider the total amount of heat production, this is single figures in terms of percentage. Dry heat loss is not particularly effective. If we consider evaporative wet heat loss, this is the predominant mechanism whereby we lose heat, the high 90%. So if we gain more heat from the environment, plus or minus the heat that we produce, and that doesn't equal our heat dissipation, we'll have hypothermic body temperatures which will ultimately decrement performance, whether it's endurance or team sport based. And we think about the precise physiological mechanisms that interrelate to cause this decrement in performance. Well, we evidently have the increase in body temperatures per se, muscle, cerebral temperature, deep core temperatures. Now these conspire to alter cardiovascular function. So we're shifting blood away from the core, so we have a reduction in stroke volume, and we have numerous other cascades which are implicated. So these conspire to reduce performance or elicit premature fatigue. So the question you should hopefully be asking yourself now is, for my athletes, how do I protect my athletes against heat-mediated performance decrements? Well, using the recent consensus statement, it's pretty clear. The most robust protection to performance decrements and to offer some protection to exertional heat illnesses is definitely heat acclimatization. And if we consider the 4 classical markers proposed that are indicative of effective heat acclimation, so we have reductions in resting core body temperature and during exercise, we have reductions in resting heart rate and those heart rate responses to the same bout of exercise, increases in sweat rate, and ultimately an improved exercise performance and capacity. And if we consider those 4 relative to the bottom schematic, it's a pretty logical scenario. So we should be heat acclimating our athletes. Now, what type of offset of the heat-mediated performance decrements can we expect? Well, if we consider these 4 classical markers of heat acclimation: performance capacity, core temperatures, sweat rates, and heart rates. And if we just look at the abbreviations on the left-hand side, so STHA, short-term acclimation, MTHA, medium-term, and then long-term heat acclimation beneath it. And the evidence is pretty clear if we look at the effect sizes generated from over a century's worth of heat acclimation data. If we look at the numerical effect sizes or the forest plots, we can see the capacity to change to produce a heat acclimated phenotype is markedly increased when we employ long-term heat acclimation compared to medium-term and short-term. That's not saying short-term and medium-term are ineffective, but we want to perform long-term heat acclimation. So some take-home messages from this excellent meta-analysis, 100 years worth of data, is that we should employ long-term heat acclimation protocols to produce robust and enduring adaptations. Another important concept is that we must retain the progression of the thermal impulse during heat acclimation. If we stick to a priori decided fixed intensity across the exercise, the acclimation bout, we're going to lose that adaptive thermal impulse. So we need to be reactive to that. So hopefully the next question you're asking yourself is, how can I heat acclimate my athletes? It's a pretty straight up decision initially between acclimatization, so we're talking about natural adaptation to the heat, or an abstract acclimation protocol, typically within the laboratory. And the nuances of this particular decision-making process is beyond this presentation. But essentially, we want the acclimation to be as representative of the environment and the exercise that athlete will perform once they're at the competition venue. Additionally, just to reiterate, it's very important to maintain the progression in the thermal impulse. And if we consider from a temporal perspective, how long those classical and slightly newer adaptations occur over, we can see plus 14 days is what we need to do. So you've got your athlete acclimated. The next question you're hopefully asking is, how long do we retain those adaptive processes for? So some more excellent data here demonstrated that for every day where heat acclimation is not performed, i.e. decay, we see a 2.5% reduction in those core temperature and heart rate responses. And some other take-home messages, again, is that longer acclimation produces more robust effects. But for me, whether that be as a scientist or a practitioner, the biggest take-home message for me was just how much more quickly reacclimation occurs relative to the initial acclimation phase. So if you perform your long-term acclimation at the beginning of the season, it's definitely prudent because you can reacclimate your athlete relative to key performance measures or competitions within the season far more quickly. So, just to summarise in terms of acclimation, in my humble opinion, long term, better than short term. Prepare for the worst WBGT rather than hoping for the best. Acclimatisation rather than acclimation. And try and retain the sport discipline specificity rather than the abstract laboratory environment. It appears prudent to acclimate for a long period of time early in the season and top up regularly relative to key performance indices. Reinduction is greater than the initial acclimation phase. Active rather than passive. Passive strategies have probably got a key application if you're trying to avoid interference with the athletic taper. And ultimately, retain that progression of the thermal impulse. And some other simple take-home messages that I'm sure you already do with your athletes is to monitor heat acclimation decay. Monitor core temperatures, perform heat stress tests, and monitor core temperatures across the season. This will allow you to determine how much reacclimation is needed relative to these key performance goals. And evidently ensure that your athletes are euhydrated with appropriate electrolyte intake, especially during acclimation or acclimatization phases. So, if time and facilities allow, I think we'd all agree that we want to acclimate our athletes early in the season and then reacclimate relative to key performances. However, that should be the end of the presentation and we should all be doing that. In the real world, that's not the case. We know that there's challenges even to elite athletes with regards to their ability to procure a heat acclimated phenotype. If we use some data from the 2015 Beijing IAAF World Champs, where we knew there was going to be very challenging thermal conditions, only 13% of the distance athletes engaged in any form of heat training. And why is that? Well, there's obvious practical, logistical limitations. Athletes may not be able to afford to travel to the venues that they need or access the equipment that they need. They may live in Scandinavia, for example. Additionally, some athletes may not want to spend 15 days with a rectal thermometer in, exercising in the laboratory, and we have to cater to our athletes' needs. So, if time allows, acclimation is key. If you cannot do that, we need to consider another strategy. This is where cooling may come into play. So if we start with pre-cooling, we're essentially trying to shift the physical body temperatures and or their perceptions prior to an exercise bout or training. I'm going to concentrate more on performance. So we typically immerse, ingest or apply a cold fluid body or medium to the body. Some of the older literature used cold air inhalation or exposure, and there's some newer pharmacological approaches to induce pre-cooling prior to an exercise bout. So if we consider what actually happens as a consequence of pre-cooling, so we're going to use some of the seminal work by Castle et al. In 2006. If we look on the two panels, we have the y-axis of rectal temperature on the bottom, muscle temperature on the top panel. We have a 20-minute cooling phase from 26 to 6 minutes. Then we have the warm-up between 6 and 0 minutes. And if we consider what happens for one of the conditions, so we have 4 conditions. We have the control condition, vest, which was simply an ice vest worn for the cooling phase. We have cold water immersion, and then ice packs placed on the quadriceps and the hamstrings. And we're going to pay particular attention to the cold water immersion condition. So if we see across the cooling phase, we see a 0.2 degrees C reduction, so the classical heat sink response. And then with an appropriate warm-up, we see a further 0.2 of a degree C reduction. So we have a 0.4 of a degree C reduction as a consequence of cooling. Now, an important point here is the warm-up. Many practitioners will say to you, I do not want to engage in aggressive pre-cooling because we have the reduction in muscle temperature and those associated effects on performance in the initial early part of the exercise bout. But if you perform an appropriate warm-up, you do not lose the reductions in core temperature and you offset the majority of the muscle decline. In all honesty, this design they probably could have done with a longer warm-up to actually raise muscle temperature where appropriate. And this was direct muscle temperature from the quadriceps. So the next question is, what happened during exercise? So this was a repeated sprint protocol using cycle ergometry, performed at 33 degrees C. So if we consider we've induced the heat sink, we've had the core temperature after drop, and if we look at the cold water immersion condition, we can see the retention of the reduction in core temperature relative to the other conditions. Then if we look at the power output towards the end of the repeated exercise bout, so we had 20 sprints, 33 degrees C. And you can see between control and the cooling conditions, we can see that power output was better maintained towards the end of the exercise when core temperature was at its highest. So it's a pretty simple concept. The problem is repeated sprint cycle ergometry lacks quite a lot of external validity to real team sport-based activity. So we wanted to move this on with specific focus to soccer and those important high-speed distances covered. So first of all, we wanted to decide what cooling approach we should use with our players or athletes. And it's pretty clear from a recent meta-analysis that mixed method pre-cooling has the greatest effect size compared to their singular applications. And if we compare mixed method cooling to the other pre-cooling approaches in terms of the performance enhancement, again we can see the greatest effect is from mixed method cooling. So we utilised the soccer simulation, which is a valid and reliable soccer simulation for both internal, external load and physical performance. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. You'll just have to trust me or read the paper. It's sensitive enough to demonstrate reductions in high-speed distances covered and the other associated internal and external load metrics in response to the simulation performed in the heat and in a temperate environment. And then we moved this on finally to explore a mixed method cooling strategy. So first of all, if we have the total distances covered in the first column, and when we're looking across the x-axis, we have the first half distances, then the second half distances, and then we have the distances on the y-axis. And we're only interested in the control and hot conditions, so 18 versus 30 degrees C. Ignore the other conditions. And we can see, as a consequence of the increase in temperature, there's a reduction in high-speed distances covered, and as alluded to earlier, a reduction in a participant's willingness to cover distances at a high speed repeatedly. So we look for a solution to this problem. And for this, we employed 4 conditions. We had a control condition, we had packs, again, ice packs on the quadriceps and hammies, we had ice slurry ingestion in line with the literature guidelines, or we had a combination of the external cooling approach, packs, and the internal cooling approach, ice slurry ingestion. And we can see only within the mixed method condition in the first half that we achieved a positive influence on performance. Those players could express distance more quickly and repeatedly compared to the other conditions. And the cooling was performed for 30 minutes prior to the soccer simulation, followed by a warm-up and then repeated at 15 minutes. So high-speed distance is covered only by the mixed method condition. The participants' willingness to cover high-speed distances repeatedly was also increased. And we saw an absence of effect in the second half. So 15 minutes of mixed methods cooling had no influence, nor did the other conditions. And if we explore why this occurred, it's a fairly simple construct. If we look at the left-hand side, so we've got panel D, E and F, where we have change in core temperature, skin temperature and thermal sensation. And we're particularly interested in the field circles, which is the mixed methods condition. And across the y-axis, we have the pre to post cooling phase, the warm-up, the first 45 minutes of the protocol, 45 to 60 is half time, 60 to 105 is the second half. And we can see if we look at the field circles, it was only the mixed methods condition that induced the greatest disturbances to physiology, i.e. the greatest cooling effect was observed to body temperatures and their perceptions. Then if we look on the right panel, so we're looking at the effect size of the intervention on key performance indices. So panel A is total distance, which is pretty much irrelevant in terms of match outcome. Panel B is high speed distances covered, and C is that self-paced willingness to cover high speed distances. So the physiology matches the performance. We had a lack of an effect in the other conditions, or an unwanted effect, and the half-time cooling did not work. We need to be more aggressive. Additionally, the cooling for 15 minutes lacks external validity. We normally have 4 to 6 minutes access to our players at half-time. So I've talked a lot about these high-speed distances covered. It may seem pretty abstract to the semi-chaotic environment of soccer match play. However, we know that a straight sprint is the most frequently observed movement prior to a goal being scored, the assist leading to the goal, or the mistake leading to a goal. So your ability to repeatedly express these movements is likely key to successful match outcome. So obviously we took this data, proposed it to a few teams to get access to their players. And some of the feedback was basically we don't want you messing around with our players for more than 30 seconds warm-up, whatever it may be on a match day, and then prior to the actual match. So we looked to use a more practical strategy, which was a high-capacity phase change cooling vest, essentially an ice vest. The heat produced by the body phase changes the material and heat is lost that way. So we're not relying upon evaporative heat loss. So it's a pretty simple design. So we used the Australian elite men's rugby sevens team, and we had a match day warm-up was performed during training, and we modelled all the different occurrences during the day on their match day scenario. So across the bottom we have the times, so 5 AM to 8:40 AM, and then we have what was occurring across the top. The key thing to observe is that from 7 o'clock, where they put the ice vest on, they did not take that off until 8:40. So they wore it during the meeting, travelled to the pitch, and during the warm-up. And the players did not complain or anything about the vest. They were pretty happy with it. We also assessed the physical characteristics of the warm-up via GPS. We also assessed counter-movement jumps for some indices of performance, and we monitored core temperature across time using an ingestible pill. We also had some perceptual measures of thermal sensation and comfort, and obviously RPE from the warm-up. And it's pretty simple data. If we look at the y-axis on the left-hand side, we can see the core temperature. The y-axis on the right has the delta core temperature. If we look across the x-axis, we have the baseline core temperature averaged over time prior to the warm-up, and then we have the warm-up peak. And as a function of that, we have the delta TC. So if we just look at the vest condition, so PCCV, we can see that the peak core temperatures were lower in the ice vest condition compared to control. And as a function of that, the delta in the core temperature was reduced. And again, the players were happy to wear the vests. Their only complaints were they weren't cold enough, but evidently they were doing at least something. So the next question is, how did that alter the warm-up perceptually? Well, we had favourable changes for condition in the ice vest condition, in thermal sensation, comfort, and a slightly smaller effect for RPE. So is that because the characteristics of the warm-up changed? No. The internal and external loads were the same between condition, irrelevant of the vest, and importantly, no markers of counter-movement jump performance were altered as a consequence of condition. The only change was seen across time, i.e. the warm-up for both conditions had the appropriate effect. The players were warmed up. So as a practitioner, you should hopefully be asking yourself now, can I combine pre-cooling with heat acclimation to augment the ergogenic effects that have been seen? And it appears the answer is pretty much no. Across a host of repeated sprint diagrams, there's no further effect. Similarly, in terms of some endurance-based activities, there appears to be no further beneficial effect on performance. So it raises the question whether perceptions or body temperatures are key to changing performance in terms of pre-cooling or perhaps during mid-cooling. And we know, as I'll talk about in the next section, we can improve endurance exercise performance in the heat simply by changing thermal perceptions rather than physical body temperatures. So just to summarise the pre-cooling section, we cool the body via various mediums to alter thermal sensations or physical body temperatures. And if you're going to use this in practice, you need to stop and consider these aspects. If you think it's compatible to that performance environment, make a decision regarding the method you're going to use, and it's most likely that a mixed method approach will be used. But we have to use some caution with internal cooling where we can actually have a negative influence on heat gain. So, moving on to mid-cooling. So this is cooling performed within the exercise bout itself. The issue here is, during the exercise bout, it's very difficult to physically shift body temperatures. So we typically try to, more recently, shift the perceptions in higher centres of the actual body temperatures. So we've shown in one of our recent reviews that you can improve performance in a hot environment without altering physical body temperatures, simply by altering their perceptions. And it's not a new approach. We've seen this in the Tour de France many years ago. We saw Farah in 2015 and the race walkers in Rio. So they were pouring the water on rather than drinking it. And obviously with Mo, for example, that's probably also linked to the very slow pace the race was on at. So it's important as a practitioner to consider the evidence available to guide your mid-cooling strategy appropriately. The issue with the majority of the existing literature is that an appropriate velocity facing wind speed has not been employed. And when that is not done, it overestimates the cooling effect that's observed from your intervention. So if we look at from the date of this review, in terms of the time to exhaustion trials, those in red or amber are probably not applicable to guide your decision making. And if we look at time trial, we see there's only a few left that just so happen to be from our group that actually guide your decision making more robustly. So first of all, one of our papers basically compared pre-cooling to a practical mid-cooling strategy, facial water spray. So we used heat acclimated individuals who performed 3 5K running time trials on a non-motorised treadmill. We used the NMT so that it would be a genuinely self-paced running bout as opposed to a motor-driven treadmill. We used cold water for 30 minutes pre-exercise, or we simply sprayed water onto the face of the participants essentially every kilometre. And the interesting thing was that the performance was improved by the same magnitude when using pre-cooling or mid-cooling. And it's a little bit difficult to interpret because we've broken up the pacing by every kilometre. But essentially, if we look at the physiology behind it, so we're looking at the graphs on the left-hand side, we have temperatures on the y-axis, skin and core, and then we have every kilometre of the time trial along the y-axis. And if we focus at the squares, the cold water immersion condition, we can see this was the only condition to physically alter core temperature or skin temperature. Now, despite the absence of this in the spray condition, so the triangles, we still saw the same magnitude of performance effect. And this was in line with both conditions having the change in thermal sensation. So hopefully this demonstrates to you that we can simply alter the perception of those tissue temperatures to improve performance. And then we just move this on slightly further, a similar paradigm, but in this instance we used a preloaded running performance, so that athletes were warmer prior to engaging in a 3K time trial on the NMT. And we used more aggressive pre-cooling, so cold water immersion and ice slurry ingestion. We also had a mid-cooling condition with facial water spray and menthol mouth rinse, and we compared, and an all condition, so throwing everything at the athlete, compared to control. And interestingly, the pre-cooling condition did not improve performance when it was used by itself. We only saw improvements in performance if we look at the graph on the left-hand side in the mid and the all condition. So pre-cooling, no effect. Mid-cooling had an effect, and the all condition had an effect. So this is likely driven by the mid-cooling strategy. And interestingly from this, so we know that mid-cooling was more effective at improving performance compared to pre-cooling, but we also saw a shift in some biochemical markers of heat stress, so prolactin for example. So not only are we not changing body temperatures, but by simply altering perceptions, we're eliciting a genuine change in higher centre-driven biochemical responses. So it's a pretty interesting combination of physiology and applied practice. And then finally, we wanted to determine the most simple way to improve running performance during a mid-cooling strategy. So we used ice slurry ingestion pre-exercise or menthol mouth rinse during exercise. And you can hopefully guess, there was only the menthol mouth rinse condition that improved performance, and similarly we've had a change in a biochemical marker of heat stress. So hopefully I've shown, at least for this particular endurance performance paradigm, that we don't necessarily need to shift body temperatures prior to exercise or during exercise to improve endurance performance. And it's that same decision making plus the consideration of legality. Some sporting codes may prevent the application of mid-cooling or wearing devices or garments or whatever may be. So consider, decide exactly what you want to do. Probably a mixed method approach of menthol mouth rinse and facial water spray or pouring the water on you would work well. We're trying to pilot some menthol gum or some capsules they can crunch and swill and then spit out. So finally, I'm going to talk about post-cooling. Very simple here. We use the similar strategies after exercise to try and reduce body temperatures or for other related recovery processes. Obviously, there's been a big increase in whole body cryotherapy, which there's limited evidence to its effectiveness, in all honesty. Some may consider it's a complete and expensive waste of money. So, in terms of why cold water immersion can be beneficial post-exercise, it's all about the rationale of your use. I think if you're looking at hypothermic athletes and their subsequent exercise performance within day, there is a use for it. If that subsequent high intensity exercise bout is within 1 hour, it's probably going to hinder that subsequent performance because you'll likely spend more time rewarming the athlete. If the subsequent bout is after 1 hour, it's likely going to be beneficial to your athlete, especially if they're getting very hot. There comes a point where you just have to aggressively call someone that's very hot, especially with repeated exercise within day, rugby sevens for example. In terms of, I'm not going to talk too much about day-to-day recovery for training. Mo Ishan's going to do a talk next month based on that with some really interesting data. But it seems to be related to better recovery day-to-day. But there will be an interference effect on some of the signalling cascades, which I'll talk about in a moment. And if you're going to, most practitioners probably use cold water immersion with a rationale to offset the secondary effects of exercise-induced muscle damage, so delayed onset muscle soreness. And this seems to be the small effect that is observable compared to a placebo or passive rest, seems to be observed in prolonged endurance or intermittent sprint-based performance, rather than isolated eccentric limb-based paradigms. And if you are going to use cold water immersion from a DOMS perspective, it's pretty simple guidelines, but you have to be aware that it's likely a placebo effect, which is good, or a very small physiological effect. It's 11 to 15 degrees C for 11 to 15 minutes, so it's easy take-home messages. Not much point going colder or for longer. So I'm just going to touch upon this. Again, as I said, Mo Ishan's going to do a brilliant presentation on this in a couple of weeks' time. There is a confounding influence of post-exercise cold water immersion on signalling cascades within the body related to endurance adaptations, mitochondrial biogenesis for example, and or resistance training. And the evidence is probably equivocal at the moment. There's not enough sample and replicated methods to make a robust decision on this. And if we consider resistance training, strength power training paradigms, I think it's pretty certain that there's an interference effect on key markers related to improvements in strength and power. So just to summarise with post-exercise cold water immersion, the key thing here is your rationale for use. If your athlete is very hot and their subsequent bout of exercise is in excess of 60 minutes, as long as an appropriate re-warm-up is performed, I think it's going to be beneficial. If it's an impact sport, such as rugby sevens, you'll have the analgesic effect as well. Although some practitioners do complain, and some of the older athletes, that they have tendon issues following aggressive post-exercise cold water immersion, something we're going to look at. So it's all about rationale in terms of why you're using it, hypothermia, DOMS approach, whatever it may be, and if you're going to use it for training or competition perspectives. So you'll hopefully be pleased that I've finished. I've gone through pre-cooling, mid-cooling, acclimation, and post-exercise cold water immersion. I'd just like to say thanks to everybody I've worked with, including a great bunch of students, peers, colleagues and collaborators, past and present. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Happy to take questions. I'll also share Dropbox links with all the papers included.